Hello and welcome to Phantom Fables TV. Don't forget to show your support by liking, commenting, subscribing, and turning on notifications. Let's get in to today's story. I never knew what a skinwalker was until a few years ago, but the first time I saw one was years ago. I was a 27-year-old med school student traveling to Appalachia from North Dakota for my medical residency. I had spent most of my money as a young adult paying for college. I didn't have a whole lot, except for my old 1980 Ford Bronco. Luckily, I was able to load all of my belongings to make one trip to a small rural hospital where I would be doing a 3-year residency. Like most doctors, nurses, and other healthcare providers, I was chronically exhausted. The place where I was going to do my residency was a small, tiny hospital tucked away in Appalachia, on the west end of West Virginia. I was excited to begin this new step in my career. Small hospitals were some of the best places to learn. Trauma centers and other larger hospitals with more capabilities may be hundreds of miles away. You may have more responsibilities for patient care. And honestly, I didn't mind the small town feel. I grew up in a tiny town in North Dakota with about 2,000 people. Everyone knew everybody. While that can be annoying, it is nice to see familiar faces wherever you go. I had some preconceived notions about how Appalachia was. Lots of low income and poor areas, coal miners, drugs, etc. But I always heard about how beautiful it was out there, regardless of those things. I personally loved being outdoors and fishing, so this would give me some time to decompress when I wasn't working at the hospital. I was a single man and had no family. My parents died several years ago when I first started medical school. They were my biggest support system, and it still bothers me. My sweet mother and my charismatic father were dead, and have been for some time. My mother was a stay-at-home mom. My father ran a mechanic shop in the local town where I grew up. I couldn't have asked for a better childhood. My father was never gone for multiple days at a time, and my mom was always home. And at every baseball game, homecoming dance, anything, my parents were there. I was very fortunate as a young man. I just hate that my time with them was cut short. I would like to think the path I'm on would make them proud of me. On the long drive, the yellow lines began to blur, and I lost track of time. I regained consciousness when I entered West Virginia, looking down at my gas gauge to see that I was below a quarter of a tank. I realized that I probably should start to look for somewhere to stop. I didn't remember seeing a town for miles. Being exhausted, I decided to stop at the next convenience store for a cup of coffee and fill up the old Bronco. A green sign was illuminated by my headlights. Louisville, 9 miles away. I had no idea how big Louisville was, or even if it had any service station in it, but I decided it was my next stop. Shortly after pulling into the small town, a buzzing neon light lit up my windshield. I came to a stop at the gas pump, closest to my door. I stepped outside for a stretch. I was surrounded by nothing but trees and forest land all around me. The night sky was illuminated with the full moon. I was surrounded by pure beauty. There was not a sign of a house for miles. I walked into the dimly lit gas station to find a small, frill old man behind the counter. I went to the coffee pot, nestled in the corner, and I poured it into the largest cup I could find, and my usual caffeinated mixture of 2 creams and 1 sugar. I sat the cup on the counter and opened my wallet, and I told the clerk I wanted $25 on pump one, and that should be more than enough to last me the rest of the trip. I was about 50 miles away from where I was going to be staying. He took the money off the counter where I sat it, and he looked up at me briefly, making eye contact. And what he said, I will never forget. "You're not from around here, are you?" I paused for a minute. "No, I'm not," I answered sternly. He went on to ask me if I had family or friends anywhere around Appalachia. I went on to explain that I was going to be here for a few years doing my medical residency, and I had no friends or family in this area. With a cold, concerned look on his face, he informed me that if I see friends or family or anyone that I haven't seen in years, it's typically not an old friend or family member coming down for a surprise visit, and it's usually quite the opposite of that, and very, very sinister. He went on to say, if anything seems off with them in the slightest way, run away. Do not look back. I was confused and struck in awe at his statement. What the hell was he talking about? My only friends lived in North Dakota and would probably never leave the town they grew up in, much less drive this far just to see me. Silence after his statement was awkward. I simply gestured to him and told him thank you before returning to my car. I filled up my Bronco before getting back inside. I cranked the truck, just pausing for a second to fully understand what the hell that interaction was. I had a strong feeling. I even went as far to turn on my cab lights to make sure I was alone in my vehicle. As I turned out of the parking lot, my headlights illuminated the road for a brief second. There was a man standing on the other side, not moving, not walking, just standing still. His eyes locked on mine. I was definitely shook by this experience and was hoping the rest of Appalachia was nothing like this little glimpse I just caught. I powered through the rest of my journey with no more strange encounters. I finally arrived at the little apartment stationed outside the small rural hospital. I was met by the head physician who was in charge of the residency program. He introduced himself as Edward. He brought me into a small studio apartment. Honestly, a very nice place, very cozy. I could see myself being comfortable here for a handful of years. He issued me a pager and told me my hours. I'll be working 8-hour shifts, typically from 7 p.m. to 3 a.m. in the emergency department. He went on to ask me if I'd ever been to Appalachia before. I informed him that this was my first time being in Appalachia, and even went to tell him about my experience at the gas station. He chuckled and said that sounds about right. He went on to inform me that this little town was about the same. The little town I was in was called Caney Creek. It was at the foot of an Appalachian mountain. I didn't get to see too much of it since it was still nighttime. We finished up our conversation before I unpacked the few belongings I had and made myself at home. I nestled myself into bed before looking up at the clock to see it was just past 4:30 a.m. I knew I was going to have to adjust my sleep schedule for working nights, but I awoke around 11 o'clock and I could no longer stand to lay in bed. I decided to get up and see the town that I'd be working at. I went to the local grocery store and stocked up on some essentials, and afterwards I drove around the little town. There wasn't much to it. A couple grocery stores, a liquor store, churches, and handfuls of houses scattered throughout. It was honestly a beautiful little town, even though it was obviously ridden with drug addicted people and poverty. Looking at the town map, I was able to drive down and find access to the river that flowed between the mountains. The water looked cool, clear, and peaceful. I was hoping that I had some spare time so that I could fish the river and maybe clear my mind and maybe brush up on a couple of things I haven't studied or thought about since graduating medical school. I returned back to my apartment shortly after. I settled myself on the couch for a few more hours' rest before reporting to the emergency room for my first shift as a resident physician. I fell into a light slumber before my alarm clock woke me. I hopped into the shower, shaved, and made sure I was sharp for my first shift as a resident physician. I reported to the emergency department. I was met by Edward, who went by Dr. Johnston in the emergency department. The first shift, I basically shadowed Dr. Johnston and learned how to document and where the supplies were, and all of the basic first day routine. After getting the basics out of the way, I followed Dr. Johnston into a few rooms. There were only about 10 beds in the emergency department, and since it was a small hospital serving a small area, half of them usually stayed empty or open. There were only 5 patients in the emergency department. three of which were psychological issues. Dr. Johnson went on to explain that there were three separate cases that were strikingly similar. The patient was alone outside, saw someone, and starting having a psychotic episode, all proclaiming that it's not the real you. It's not the real you. Probably a bad batch of meth rolling through town, Dr. Johnston snickered. Not that there is such a thing as a good batch of meth, I suppose. All three of the patients were tied down to the beds and heavily sedated. Dr. Johnston informed me to keep these patients sedated and, for any reason, if they woke up, give them more sedation. And if it continues for more than 8 hours, the patient would have to be put into a medically induced coma. I found this very strange. Appalachia was known for drug use and poverty. I guess some psychological issues followed these things, but not to this degree. I asked Dr. Johnston how long this has been going on in our area. He informed me this is pretty normal, and they see up to 12 patients like this a week with the same story. They saw a friend or family member and began to scream, "It's not really you." I found this very odd. Almost all of our psychiatric patients told the same story and work proclaiming the same thing. Dr. Johnson went on to explain there's probably only one meth manufacturer in the area, so more than likely there's only one batch of meth floating around, and it's affecting people the same way for most cases. But the number of cases that are exactly the same is mind-boggling. The sedated psychiatric patients were transferred to a psychiatric facility on the other side of the mountains, leaving the ER empty. Dr. Johnston and I sat in his office, getting to know each other, catching up, talking about med school, just generally getting to know each other. After about an hour of this, one of the nurses came back to his office to inform us that we had a patient checking in. As I made my way to the registration window at the front of the ER lobby, I found a dark shadow of a person standing there. I placed myself into the box with the registration lady so I could immediately start talking to the patient to see what was going on with them, so I could go ahead and start talking about treatment. It was a middle-aged woman, maybe 55 years old. Due to the bonnet she was wearing over her head and the trench coat, I was unable to see her face. Her eyes locked on me for just a second, just long enough to see my face. The registration asked her again, "I'm sorry, ma'am. What did you say your name was?" As she made eye contact with me once again, she muttered the words, "Margaret, Margaret Stockton." She removed her bonnet, now looking up to me, fully showing her face, and standing in front of me was my mother, the woman that raised me, the woman that's been dead for 4 years. My knees grew weak, my face got clammy. I ran out of the registration box, back into the ER to sit down. She looked exactly like my mother. She even had my mother's first and last name. There were only a couple of things that were slightly off from my mother. Her eye color was black, and her ears were slightly offset from each other. Other than that, it was my mother. Dr. Johnston ran to my side. "What's wrong, son?" he asked. I stammered, That's my mom." With a confused look on his face, he pressed on me. "I thought you were from North Dakota." "I am," I explained, "and my mother's been dead for 5 years." A puzzled look came across his face. "Are you okay, son?" he asked. "I don't know," I answered. I pulled a picture of my mom and dad out of my pocket. I kept it with me everywhere I went. They always told me as a child, "We love you, and you can do anything you want." Dr. Johnston looked at the picture and chuckled. "Wow, it certainly does resemble your mother quite a bit. I'll tell you what, why don't you sit this one out? I can see that it strikes close to home." I finally put myself back together and gathered my thoughts. I went to help the nurses clean up and restock the rooms. Dr. Johnston found me and pulled me to the side. "Son, this woman says that she knows you, and she wants to see you and speak to you." My blood ran cold once again. Dr. Johnston patted me on the shoulder before telling me I could speak to her alone. I approached the room she was sitting in. Sitting upright on the bed, she looked at me, straight in my eyes. "Well, Jacob, how have you been, son?" And now that I heard her voice, I definitely knew it wasn't my mother. Whatever this was, I had my mother's face, body size, frame, everything, just slightly off. Who are you? I stammered. Sinister eyes locked with mine and said, "Don't be rude, Jacob. I'm your mother." No, no, you're not, I exclaimed. I ran out of the room. Dr. Johnston grabs my arm. Where are you going? Far away from here as possible. That woman in there is claiming she's my mother. That's not my mother. My mom's been dead for 5 years. Dr. Johnston looked concerned. Look, son, there's only a couple of hours left in your shift. Why don't you return back to your apartment and call it a night? That woman is not my mother, Dr. Johnston. I swear. I don't know who she is. Dr. Johnston looked concerned and reassured me everything was okay. I returned to my apartment and got into my bed, tossing and turning for hours. What the hell was that? It looked like my mother, almost exactly like her, and she was claiming to be my mother, but they've been dead for over 5 years. What the fuck is going on? Could this be what the man in the gas station was talking about? Are there other people seeing things similar? Could this be the explanation for all the psychotic episodes and the patients in this small town? I had so many questions, I didn't know what the hell to do. I called the medical board the next morning and demanded to be transferred to another hospital for my residency. To say the least, they were frustrated with my request. I see that you had your first run in with the drug addicted psych patients. I further tried to explain the other people in the area were experiencing something similar, and that I had no idea how this woman, who claimed to be my mother, knew me, knew my name, and knew my mother's name. I went on to explain that I didn't even have any friends or family anywhere close to West Virginia. "I'll see what I can do," he grumbled, obviously frustrated with my request. Dr. Johnston called me back and asked me to come to work 30 minutes early so we could have a discussion. I came into Dr. Johnston's office, fully expecting for him to be upset with me. I came into his office to find him staring down at his desk. I sat in the chair in front of him, and he slowly looked up at me, and what I saw made my bones quiver. It looked just like Dr. Johnston, but the nose was slightly offset, with black eyes and a voice that did not match the man that I had met. His cold, strange voice told me, "Mr. Jacob, please don't forget that even if patients seem to strike something in you, we still have a job to do, and you are not to leave the emergency room under any circumstance. Do you understand?" I couldn't let whoever this was, or whatever this was, that I was on to him. With the last remaining courage I had scraped together, a semi-formed sentence, and said, "Yes, Dr. Johnson, I understand. Let me just run back to my apartment and grab my stuff and my stethoscope, and I'll be ready for the night." "Very good, Dr. Stockton. I'll be here waiting," and a crooked smile slid across his face. I walked back to my apartment, and as soon as I got there, I threw my belongings into my Bronco and put the pedal to the floor until I was far away from West Virginia. Some weeks later, the medical board called me to ask me what happened. I tried to explain it in the best way possible, obviously mad at my actions and my decisions. Fortunately for me, there was a national shortage of doctors, and they were forced to relocate me rather than kick me out. To this day, I won't go within 100 miles of anywhere close to Appalachia. We hope you enjoyed today's story. Please don't forget to show your support by liking, commenting, subscribing, and turning on notifications.